Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. The startup ecosystem in the country is facing several challenges. The ecosystem is growing, but it is faced with several challenges. And one of the key challenges is access to funding. In her recent interim budget, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has announced certain schemes that could directly benefit startups and the startup ecosystem. Today, we have with us two experts with deep understanding about the startup ecosystem and taxation. Srikanth Velamakanni is the founder and group CEO of Fractal, which is into analytics and AI, and Shruti is a senior partner with IndusLaw. She is an expert on taxation. Welcome to the podcast, Srikanth, Shruti.
Thank you.
Srikanth, you are working with the startup ecosystem for over 15 years or even 20 years, and you yourself is a successful startup. What are the three major challenges that the startup ecosystem is facing?
See, in general, Kurmanath, startups are risky ventures, right? And in general, companies have a very high chance of failure. Here are the stats. 1 in 2 startups fails within 2 years, first 2 years, and 98% of all startups close by 10 years. So they're always battling an existential battle of proving themselves, making sure that they're building something that's really useful to a customer, making sure they're able to make money from it, making sure that they're able to pay people on time, they're able to raise finances, and eventually drive success and growth. So the battles of startups are always existential. And the biggest battles really are about being able to attract talent, build a product that customers really want, making sure that you have enough money and you're able to manage the cash flows to stay solvent and stay liquid and to stay in business and to fight the battle for survival. And eventually, I think every startup will want to conquer the existential battles and then start growing. But really, the battles are all survival battles in the first few years of any startup.
See, in the last 1-2 years, the startup ecosystem is facing, not just in India, globally, it's facing funding winter. And it is only deepening over the last year. So the announcement that the finance minister, that the government is going to launch a corpus of 1 lakh crore, particularly to promote research and innovation, it looks very promising and interesting. How actually, it's going to help the startup ecosystem in general and startups in particular?
Firstly, I think the funding winter, there is definitely investments. There are cycles of investments and going up and then going down. The good news is that there is a lot of capital that is available to be deployed across the world, across all the private equity, venture capital, and other kinds of firms that invest. There is a lot of money waiting to be deployed. But there is also fear and uncertainty. Therefore, sometimes the flows go up and down. I think in the short to medium term, the good news is that there is a lot of capital ready to be deployed across the world, including India. So I think we should certainly look at that and feel good about the fact that capital problems are not going to be there for the long term. The other thing that's happening is because of all the latest developments in the world of tech and AI, the amount of money required to build a deep tech startup actually is coming down, not going up, because some of the access to GPT-4 and other kinds of technologies has actually reduced the need for how many people are required to build a startup. Even a one-person startup is a complete possibility today. And one person can sit in their dorm room and build a whole startup in a few weeks' time. That's possible. So the amount of capital required to build a startup is coming down. So these are some good news as far as where things are going. Now, coming to the Indian budget and the promise of investing 1 lakh crores or 1 trillion rupees, which is roughly $12.3 billion into these startups and helping them take very long-term loans. The policy it's not a policy, it's really a statement at this point of time. The intent is that we will put something like $12.3 billion to work and we will give 50-year loans that are interest-free to these startups for investing in R&D and doing some deep interesting innovative stuff. Now, this is very interesting because I think such kinds of funds will help companies in taking more risks and dreaming bigger. If you think of what is wrong with Indian startups or where can Indian startups get better, I think we have to invest in even more cutting edge ideas, invest even more in research. So in some ways, if this kind of investment supports research, it will be great. I'll also say that most startups can't wait for this kind of funding to be deployed and disbursed. And sometimes it takes weeks, months, years to actually get the grants or access to that funds that are actually been promised. As a startup, you're always battling the test of time. Can you really survive before you can raise money? And sometimes when these delays happen, they may not be able to pay salaries. They may not be able to wait for such things to happen. So we have whatever policy, when this announcement is made into a policy and it's disbursed, I think one has to make sure that the amount of paperwork required and the amount of time required is minimal so that it really helps startups in depending on this source of funding to make the investments in R&D.
Shruti, the budget has yet another interesting proposal for startups. She has proposed that the deadline for 3-year tax holiday for incorporation window has been extended by 1 more year. How this is going to help startups, Shruti?
So the starting point for a startup to obtain the benefit under Section 80 IAC, which is a profit-linked exemption from taxation that is provided to new startups, is that the company should have been incorporated before 1st of April 2024. So now what happens is a company which is incorporated up till 31st of March 2025 will also be eligible for this benefit under 80 IAC. So the essential effect of this extension is that new startups which are going to set up business, start operations or incorporate rather in the next 1 year will also be eligible to obtain this benefit. But one point I would like to just highlight here is that this is not the only requirement that a startup has in order to be eligible for the profit exemption from taxation under 80 IAC. There is also a very important requirement that the startup obtain a registration from the interministerial board of the Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. Now, this is where all the startups, need to consider how eligible will they be to obtain the benefit, because the criteria based on which that DPIIT and the IMB identify eligible startups to be eligible for this tax exemption is rather, it's very strict and there are certain conditions which need to be satisfied. So the reality of the situation perhaps is that very few startups do indeed get the benefit of this 80 IAC. To go by public documents, we believe that it might be as low as less than 2% of all the startups in the country who are eligible to obtain the benefit of the profit-linked exemption from taxation. So this is one aspect which also needs to be borne in mind. A mere extension perhaps may not really spell a lot of benefit for a startup, but the requirement of the IMB registration also needs to be obtained to get the benefit of the tax exemption.
Okay. So the original scheme says in the first 10 years of their incorporation, they can start availing of this particular benefit. Does it mean they are going to have 1 more year, 3+1? Can you please explain that?
No, that is not how it will be. Basically, the requirement, the definition of an eligible startup means, among other things, a company which is incorporated on or after 1st of April 2016, but before 1st of April 2024. Okay. So the incorporation condition alone has been extended for 1 more year, which means that an eligible startup will now include a company, a new incorporated company, up to 1st of April 2025.
Okay. Got you.
If I could add to that, so first of all, I think it's a 10-year window. So if a company has been started after 2016 and up to 2025, in the first 10 years, at any point of time when they start making profits, for 3 years in a row, they can deduct 100% of profits and not pay taxes for it. That is the scheme. And it's a well-intentioned scheme, fully appreciate that. I think the key issue is most startups don't make money, or they find the first few years, are actually a struggle in order to establish their relevance, establish the product market fit, make revenues, and then at some point of time start making profits. So it does not change the survival mechanics of a startup. It only will help when the startup starts to make decent profits. It can say, hey, look, I don't have to pay taxes, I get exemption. I think what we have to also do is to see how to help these startups, first of all, get to profitability, right? And what can we help them in the first few years? And the reason Shruti's point is so valid is because only 2% of the companies will reach that stage where they're eligible and they're making profits, and then the taxation benefit starts to apply. So taxation benefits usually are something that bigger companies enjoy more than the smaller startups, right? Because they're not yet making money.
Absolutely, Srikanth, you're absolutely right. So it is indeed questionable whether all the startups will make profits to be even eligible for this the tax deduction. And also, in addition to that, how many of the startups will indeed qualify for the eligibility? Because it's very, very stringent as to what companies or what kind of businesses, whether it is wealth generating, whether there'll be immense value add, whether it is innovative. All of these conditions are closely examined by the IMB before they even give the benefit of this tax exemption. So there, in both those scenarios, we really need to examine how many startups really benefit from this tax exemption that has been proposed under the Income Tax Act.
Okay, thanks, Shruti. Srikanth, coming back to the budget, there is another important news from announcement from the Finance Minister. She says they are going to announce a scheme to promote deep tech startups in the defense sector. I know that you are involved very much in the deep tech sector. Can you tell me how actually this can help the startups in this space?
Yeah, again, we have to await the actual scheme. The general intent is about helping deep tech startups in the areas of defense. I think it's a super important topic because, especially in an area like defense, countries have various policies about export and import of these kinds of technologies. So I'm on the board of Idea Forge, which is India's largest unmanned aerial vehicle operator, drone manufacturer. And you can see that a company like that will have, a lot of their clients actually come from the government sector. And there are several restrictions on import and export of drones, etc. Therefore, encouraging companies like these, so indigenous technology is actually super important in such an industry. So in these industries, if the government comes up with a scheme that promotes development of these kinds of companies where the beneficiary actually is the government, because defense, largely Indian defense will be the client for that. I think it's very important. I would say that the scheme could take shape of in the shape of co-investing in defense in company startups. For example, you would see the famous example of Palantir, which is an American AI company. It was actually born in 2002-03 after the 9/11 attacks, when CIA funded this entity. And it was called InQtel. CIA's investment agency is called InQtel. And they invested in Palantir. And now Palantir has become a huge company, right? $2-3 billion in revenue, $35-40 billion in market cap. And it is because of the investments by the government or government-funded agency into Palantir. So what can India do in terms of co-investments in defense companies, Indian startups in the areas of defense, or even be willing to provide use cases and or say that, okay, I have this much money which I will use for various use cases, and this will be restricted to Indian startups which are, let's say, less than 100 crores and less than 5 years old. That would also help in promoting Indian startups in the areas of defense.
Okay, you have partly answered my question. Do we actually have enough bandwidth in the space which can actually really tap this opportunity? Drones, of course, we made some beginning. Are there any other segments that we can immediately tap?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think India is a very big purchaser of defense equipment around the world. I think we are probably one of the largest, I think in the top 5 for sure. For many countries like France and others, we are the largest buyer of their defense equipment and so on. So India has the demand and the money to buy this equipment. We don't have the supply of startups and really good ideas. So if there's a way in which we can promote this, I think it should really take off. And it's a very strategically important area for India. For example, cybersecurity, super important area. We may need Indian startups that are doing cutting edge work in cybersecurity. It could be in the world of AI. So much of AI is required for various kinds of defense purposes, which we'll see in the next few years. It could be drone technologies. It could be other defense equipment. I think it's a strategically important area for India. So any scheme that actually promotes more startups to come and take the risks, I think it'll really do a world of good.
Yeah, the 1 lakh crore corpus looks so ambitious. Perhaps the government will start off with rolling out in a certain phase, like a 5-year, 10-year phase. But if government has to focus on certain few things to start with in the first phase, what are your suggestions? Where actually government can deploy this 1 lakh crore?
So 1 lakh crore is roughly $12.3 billion we just discussed. So look at the challenge. India currently Indian private sector spends only 0.3% of revenue on R&D. And all across India, government and private included 0.6% or 0.7% of revenue, 0.7% of GDP on R&D, which means that we are 1/5 or 1/4 of the world average. US averages at 3% of GDP on R&D. China averages 3%, and other countries are maybe even higher, countries like Israel, etc. So smaller countries may have higher percentage in R&D. So this kind of a $12 billion corpus will help in promoting R&D expenditure across private and government sectors. So I think any such very strategic areas for India over the next 5 to 10 years, it could be AI, it could be quantum computing, where India already has announced a certain scheme of 7,000 crore quantum mission. So AI, quantum computing, defense tech or drone tech, these are the kinds of areas where I would think it should go initially. Even building India's foundational models in case of GPT-4 like models for India, these kinds of investment will be helpful. Even the computation infrastructure of GPU infrastructure for India, the foundational investments will make a big difference in creating the startups that will actually use these investments to build big companies. Okay.
Thanks very much, Srikanth and Shruti. Your insights actually, they shed light on the government's proposals. Hope they take shape soon with the discussions with industry bodies and startup agencies. Hope these will take some shape and help the startup ecosystem. Thanks very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kurmanath.